Welcome to the M&A Unplugged podcast. Our mission is to help you be better prepared for your business acquisition or sale. Being prepared will ensure you maximize returns and minimize risks. This is M&A Unplugged with your host, Domenic Rinaldi.
Welcome back. I'm Domenic Rinaldi, host of the M&A Unplugged podcast. From my perspective, the most important asset in an acquisition is the people. There is no other more important asset. They make the engine run. How you handle the integration of the people really matters. We are being joined today by Dr. Klint Kendrick. He's an HR expert who's been involved in over 70 M&A deals. He's the author of the HR Practitioner's Guide to M&A Due Diligence. He also founded the HR M&A Roundtable, which is a peer learning platform for HR professionals to help them gain knowledge and skills so that when their companies are going out and doing M&A transactions, they're prepared. Losing employees or productivity after an acquisition can kill your ROI. Don't let that happen. If you want to understand the best practices for integrating employees, you won't want to miss this episode. Before we get into the interview, please head over to K2 Advisor. If you want to avoid common deal pitfalls, the risk of losing substantial dollars, you need to know how ready you are for the transaction. So I decided to better support the people in our community, I will be opening up enrollment and taking applications for a small number of people who need help and coaching on how to be better prepared to buy or sell a business. I'm limiting enrollment, so email us as soon as possible if you're interested. You can do that by sending an email to info@k2advisor.com and request info on our coaching opportunity. Being prepared is critical to ensuring that you maximize returns and minimize risk. Thank you for being here and hope you enjoyed today's episode. Dr. Kendrick, welcome to the M&A Unplugged podcast. So happy to have you here.
Great. Thanks, Domenic. I'm excited to be here.
So as I mentioned, you are the author of the HR Practitioner's Guide to Mergers and Acquisitions Due Diligence. You're also the founder of the HR Mergers and Acquisitions Roundtable. So you come with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. I'm really excited to unpack due diligence as it relates to HR. But before we get in, if you wouldn't mind giving the M&A Unplugged community a little bit of background on yourself and how you got into HR M&A.
Yeah, absolutely, Domenic. Really glad to be here and to be able to share some of the things that I've learned both from my 70 plus deals and from the experience that I've gained talking with people in the roundtable community. I've been doing M&A for about 8 years now. I've done it for a number of companies that folks would recognize the names of, ranging from aerospace to technology to entertainment and media to consumer packaged goods. All of my experience has been in-house, and I've had the fortune of working with a number of really great people that have helped shape me into a person who I think has a lot to offer folks who care about leadership and culture and people inside their deals.
Were you always involved in corp dev and doing M&A deals, or how did you get involved in M&A?
Sure. So I started in HR a while back before I had all this gray in the beard. And I just happened to work for a company that needed somebody to fill that HR M&A role. And being a decent project manager and a guy with a business head on his shoulder, they said, "Hey, Clint, go check this opportunity out." And I was fortunate enough to have a really good mentor working for a serial acquirer and really got my hands dirty early on, partnering with some really great corp dev folks who were, willing to take the HR guy along for the ride and allow me to contribute where I could.
That's great. So you got to see the whole, you were part of the deal team and you got to see the whole deal then, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. I was pulled in on a couple of deals prior to the LOI, which is fairly unusual for an HR person. Yeah, and I'm glad they did. When you look at what you're going to do with an acquisition and you look at what goes on with the people, sometimes you need another set of eyes. One deal I can remember, we were going to take this acquisition and grow it quite a bit. But when we looked at the talent market in this particular country, there weren't enough people to do the work we were planning to do. So had they not pulled me in to do the labor market analysis early on in that deal, we could have spent a lot of money and then struggled to find people to fill the jobs so that we could grow that business appropriately.
Yeah, that's great. What great experience. And what I know will translate is a lot of our listeners, don't have the benefit of having big corporate development teams to do acquisitions. And so, they're having to do the HR component themselves, or maybe, outsource it to a professional if they have the resources. But in most cases, they're figuring out the HR themselves. And my experience has been an inordinate amount of time and effort goes into the numbers and the financials and whether or not the deal, makes sense and where the money is going to come from. And HR, sort of comes at the tail end. I don't want to say it's an afterthought, but it kind of is. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about and address when people don't have teams of HR people, how can they approach HR? What are the things they should be thinking about as they go through and look at diligence from this perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that's part of why I wrote the book, Dominic. It's not for the companies that I've come from, where there's, often a professional like myself with a lot of experience, or even a team with, a dozen or so HR people for some of the larger serial acquirers. But this is really written for the solo practitioner who's the person that has a company that wants to go buy something and they don't know where to start. When I sat down to write, I said, if I were to write a due diligence playbook for a person in HR who got that phone call, hey, we're about to go buy somebody, and they're doing that, oh crap moment,
Mm-hmm.
I want this book to be their guide. And so I really think that I break it down in a way that's really accessible. And when I think about due diligence, I think about risk, and I think about identifying risks, assessing risks, and then figuring out how you're going to mitigate those risks.
And so as it relates to the human capital part of that, what are the typical, risks that are involved? What are the things, the most important things when it comes to the human capital that acquirers should be thinking about?
Yeah. So I think about these risks really in 6 distinct categories. And just like any other, categorization system, there's going to be some overlap. I think what most folks in corp dev and the business think about are the first 2, which are the financial and operational risks. What's this going to do with our money? And how are the people going to affect how we run this business? Then, we start to slide into some other risk areas like compliance risk. Are we doing things the right way? Are there a bunch of penalties and fees waiting for us if something got done incorrectly? And then I look at leadership and culture, which have an inordinate effect on operations. We don't tend to think about it that way, but really who you have running your business and the culture that you've built up inside the business is going to affect how you run the business. And that in turn is going to affect how profitable and productive your business is. And then finally, I look at how the HR operation is run. So, how is the HR team staffed and structured? What are the tools and techniques they use?
So let's dive in there a little bit. So you're an acquirer and you're looking at a target business and you're trying to assess, the talent pool that you have, how they're going to feel about the acquisition and whether or not there's a good cultural fit, right? For whether you're a group of investors that are going to run this yourselves or you're a company acquiring another company, you really need to think about the culture aspect and the talent pool. What are your ideas and best practices around that?
Sure. So I think culture is one of those words that, it's pretty amorphous, right? People make culture mean what they want it to mean in the moment. When I think about culture and business, I think about the way things get done in a particular business. So let me give you an example that affects the people. When we think about things like travel and expense policies, so a lot of small companies The sales team, everybody's running around on their own credit card, getting their own airline miles, making their own travel reservations, staying at their own hotels, and figuring that out on their own. A large acquirer can come in, and then all of a sudden you've got this travel and expense policy that doubles or even triples the amount of time that it takes for this person to go book meetings with clients, because now they've got to go into a separate system and they've got to fill out all these brand new expense reports. And there's a learning curve associated with that. So you've got your sales team that's used to being able to do things a certain way. We've added this administrative burden to how they go do things. And then we wonder in a couple of months why they're less productive. Well, we've taken a couple hours out of their day every day to go work on this administrative overlay. We've changed the way that they have to go do business.
So let me ask you then, when you, and I want to get to how you really assess the fit. So when you're assessing fit, is it more about the policies and procedures and the way people have done business? Or is there also this other component around their morals and beliefs, or are the two completely intertwined and you can't really separate them?
Yeah, I think you have a difficult time pulling the two apart. I mean, it's hard to get line of sight between, how I do in my expense report and my values as a person, right? They're pretty difficult. But when we think about how a company operates, is it top heavy? Are things top down? Or is it more equitable, where everybody in the organization gets a vote? How does communication flow? Does it move from the top? Does it move through managers? And when I think about culture fit, I also have to think about what's the final integration plan. So if I'm going to leave the organization standalone, then I'm going to have a different kind of culture conversation than if I'm going to fully integrate the business. And sometimes those culture conversations and looking at culture fit is really about what I call the change agility of the organization. So how well will the people in this company be able to pivot to do things a new and different way? And does that new and different way align with what I say the values are? So if I say I'm a human-centric company, but I have a bunch of policies that, punish people for showing up 30 minutes late, well, that's not going to line up, and that's going to make that change harder to go from, where the target company is now to where that new part of our company is going to be when we integrate. So I hope that helps provide a little bit of perspective about how the values and the policies play into one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me take that now another step further. So in the large deals that you're used to working on, these are usually announced well in advance. The teams come in and you're working on diligence. In a lot of the smaller, lower middle market deals, usually there's no announcement. In fact, they don't want employees to know that there's going to be an acquisition until the day that it happens, other than, key employees that have to be, locked up in some way. So what's your advice to people on how you assess culture when you can't touch and feel and really talk to the employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me take just a little bit of a step back and say that I've worked on deals of all sizes. I've worked on billion-dollar deals where, the public company I've worked for is buying another public company. And certainly there's regulatory waiting periods involved. I've also done a deal with two people.
Okay, great. So you know what you understand the genesis of the question here then.
Absolutely. And I would say the bread and butter deal at one of the companies that I've worked for was about 100 people in the technology world. So your founder tends to know, some of the C-suite tends to know, but your rank and file employees don't know. So how do I assess culture? Well, I'm going to talk to the founder. I'm going to get a sense of them, but they're going to have one perspective. There are other perspectives on how that company operates. So going out and looking at Glassdoor, looking at their social media feed, just looking at the company's website tells me a lot about the culture. What are they promoting? Do they have an About Us section where they tell me the story of the company? Can I look at their marketing materials and really understand the voice of that company and how compatible it is with us? There is a list that we have of some of the key cultural inflection points, really, those things that tend to create challenges for employees to go through that change. And I tend to look back at some of those things, and it comes back to communication. It comes back to looking at things as simple as job titles. So having worked for big companies, not everybody can be a vice president. And I remember sitting in my guest office one day when we were doing a deal, and a young lady who was the director of customer experience, her new job title was event planner 2. And it was just a huge blow to her ego. It's not something I wanted to do either, because I knew that she was more valuable to that startup than an event planner 2.
Mm-hmm.
But when we went to do that job title alignment, it just hit her right there. It was like a gut punch. And we knew that was going to be a challenge because we'd looked at the job titles in the data room when we got our employee census sheet. So there are a lot of little artifacts that we can look at that tell us where there may be some challenges integrating folks into different cultural contexts.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I'm glad that we started with culture, because it's such a big component of an acquisition, and knowing whether or not the two companies are going to merge, or like I said, if you're just an investor group walking in, whether or not your personalities and characteristics are going to fit in that existing culture, or whether or not you're going to have some headwinds and need to get ahead of that.
Yeah.
So let's move on from culture, and let's talk about some of the other things from an HR perspective that acquirers should be thinking about as they walk through due diligence.
Certainly. So I tend to think most folks are going to start with the finances. That's obviously the reason that we do deals, is there's some sort of strategic objective, whether it's around the top line or around growth or around filling some sort of white space. But usually that's going to come down to the finances and the operations. And when we look at how people get involved in the financials, usually it's cost, right? What do the payroll costs look like? Just one little tip that can be helpful. I like to look at payroll costs of the past 3 years. A lot of times when a group is getting ready to sell even a small business, they do a little bit of housekeeping, right? Mm-hmm. Folks that are a bit of dead weight or aren't meeting their quotas, they're let go, hopefully in a respectful way. But it's always a bit of a red flag for me when I look at the payroll expense 3 years ago, and it was, 150% of what's on the financials right now.
Mm-hmm.
Are people now working 60, 80 hours? Am I going to have to do something extraordinary to retain them? And that then feeds into the operations. There's all these little Venn diagrams that happen where you can't quite put things into clean buckets. When I look at operations and people, it's, do they have the right organization design? Am I going to have to change that organization design when it comes time for us to integrate? And is that going to create some challenges? Am I going to lose key folks that are really necessary to run the business? I've looked at companies very recently where, from an operational perspective, they're missing some of the C-suite. And those positions have been vacant for 6, 9, 12 months. And it always makes me scratch my head and go, well, do they not know what they need? Are they not paying these people enough? Are they just holding that position open for future growth? It's not always a bad news story, but I like to understand what the plan is to run that business through its people.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. We'll also see some crazy things sometimes happen with compensation where they didn't pair people, but they actually increased salaries because they wanted to take care of some people.
Yeah.
And not realizing that, oh my goodness, once people start to dive in, if there's a new salary set, that might change valuation.
Yeah.
If you're doing it on the heels of, an acquisition. We've had that before. We're in diligence, and while we're in diligence, somebody changed compensation for some of their key employees. The buyers found that, and all of a sudden there was a discussion around, well, you've just changed the EBITDA of this business in sometimes substantial ways.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I sometimes see is changes to the incentive makeup. So if there's a transaction bonus that's suddenly added, and I'm trying to figure out how to do a meaningful retention plan, well, you've just changed that math as well.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about compliance and leadership. Why don't we talk a little bit about those items?
Yeah, so compliance is one of those areas where, it helps to have an HR geek. When we start to look at things like compliance with overtime laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act, most small businesses, I don't know if it's actually most, I'll say many small businesses don't do a great job of classifying people in accordance with the law. There's very specific rules around who has to be paid overtime and who doesn't. And a lot of small businesses just don't have the sophistication to understand that. And sometimes there's penalties and back wages associated with that kind of misclassification. So that's one of the big things I see. Sometimes 401k plans aren't set up properly, and we have to go in and fix those. In my experience, those are never really a showstopper. It's one of those things that we know is an issue. We'll clean it up during integration. And, I really firmly believe that most founders are really well-intentioned people trying to do their best. And, an HR geek like me stumbles across a problem, and that's really more about awareness. So we know what we're going to have to go clean up later.
Yeah. I'll tell you, one of the big ones, compliance, that we see a lot of is if you don't have a very clear policy around vacation carryovers. And, if you don't have a use it or lose it policy that's, written and communicated, we've had situations where people have assumed that vacation days just kept on rolling over, and all of a sudden there's a transaction and somebody wants to get paid out their 50 days that they've got in the bank of vacation.
Yep.
That's a pretty big number.
Yeah, and in some cases, that's legally required, depending on how you move the employees, whether you're changing their legal entities, and depending on the state that you're in, you could actually be legally obligated to pay that out if it's what we call a technical termination, meaning that the person is being, terminated from the seller because they're being moved into the buyer's legal entity. Again, lots of caveats, but sometimes you do have to pony up that cash, and it's well, I mean, sometimes the employees are really happy, right? Look at all this money, but you want to know that that's happening.
Yeah. While we're talking about that, the firing and the rehiring of people, if they're going to be going into a new entity, have you come across like a really good, seamless way to bring all the employees together and have this communication? Because that can be scary, right? What do you mean I'm being fired? Well, it's just a technicality, right? Because they're being moved from one entity to another. But is there a best practice around, the day the acquisition happens, bringing everybody together and having the, HR communications plan?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. Later today, with the HR M&A roundtable I run, we're doing just an informal happy hour on announcement day best practices.
Oh.
So your timing is quite good, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately. And I would say that there's a few things. One, you want to go in understanding that this is probably news to the employees. This is a surprise to them. And, the founders up there, often a few $1 million richer and very happy, and is completely out of sync with the rest of the employees who are stunned. They're sitting in their seats and they're thinking, oh my God, can I pay my mortgage? Is my kid still going to be able to get braces or, heaven forbid, some other form of medical care? Am I still going to get paid the same? Do I have a job? And the founders up there, talking about the strategic vision for the combination. Well, the employees don't care at that point.
Right.
They really do not care what your growth strategy is. They want to know that they can feed their kids and pay their mortgage.
Right.
So I say start with a very high degree of empathy. Be very transparent. If you know everybody's going to stay, say so. If you don't know that, don't say so, because if you're going to end up letting folks go and you tell them that everybody's going to stay, the minute you do your first termination, you'll lose everybody else.
Yeah.
You'll have destroyed that trust. Other things that I try to do when I coach the leaders on announcement day is to make sure that they don't answer questions they don't know the answer to. It's okay to not know the answer. And I don't know, but here's the process we're going to follow to figure that out.
Yeah.
And then commit to a regular communications cadence afterwards. And those make it easier, but we have to acknowledge that that's a hard day. And I have a friend who works in executive search, and he says, acquisition announcements are like blood in the water. If headhunters are sharks, they're going to smell that, they're going to go after it. And sure enough, I've done deals in high growth, very competitive talent spaces Somebody sees in their RSS feed that, this company's buying that company, and we will literally have people find out about the acquisition because they got a call from a headhunter
Oh,
30 minutes before our announcement meeting happened. So,
wow.
yeah, I mean, it's really critical to do those well, because highly marketable employees are going to have lots of options.
Without a doubt. And, so while we're on this topic of what to tell the employees and whatnot, the topic of timing always comes up with business owners and even with business buyers. And our best practice around that is don't tell people unless they absolutely have to
Yeah.
be in the know in order to get the transaction done, because they're going to have tons of questions. And the questions that they're going to have, you can't answer as an owner. You don't absolutely know who the buyer is when you start marketing. You don't know absolutely if everybody's going to keep their job. You don't know about there's so many things you don't know. And when you can't answer questions, people get nervous. And when people get nervous, like you just referenced, they have mortgages, they have college tuitions. People are going to go take care of themselves. So that might lead them to go find another job. And there goes value walking right out the door.
Yeah, absolutely, Dominic. The other thing that I find really helpful, because you can't let everybody know. It's just, it's problematic. I've been on the sell side a few times doing some carve outs, and we're very careful about who we let into the circle of trust, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But then we're also very mindful about how we help people out once it gets announced. So one of the other announcement day best practices that I think is a really good one is to have a separate meeting for your middle managers. The most trusted source of information for most employees is their immediate manager. And we have this unfortunate norm where we pull everybody into the room and we've given their manager 10 minutes of notice, right? So like, hey, in 10 minutes, we're about to go do this company-wide announcement that we've been bought by so-and-so. And unfortunately, that means that middle manager is stuck with the same questions that those employees have about their mortgage and their college tuition and their healthcare.
Yeah.
Instead, I recommend giving them a little bit more time. I realize you can't give them days to process, but give them an hour.
Yeah.
And I try to provide really good tools when I go into those meetings that say, hey, you're shocked right now. And I've been acquired a few times in my career, by the way, Dominic. So there's some, I know what I'm talking about because I've lived it. And so I try to give them some good tools. I try to give them permission to be where they are. And again, I really try to assume the best of people. And I assume that those managers, they want to take care of their families, but they also want to take care of their employees and their employees' families. So let's give them some tools on how to do that. Let's coach them on how to answer those hard questions. And again, give them permission to say, hey, you know what? I don't know yet, but I know our leader, and I know our leader has our best interests in mind. Let's give him a chance to sort this out.
Yeah. So you bring them into the fold a little bit earlier. They feel a little bit more in the know. And that is your first line of defense, right?
Yeah.
As you reference. You talked about regular communication. I'd like you to talk about that for a minute. And I'd also like you to talk a little bit about keeping your pulse on the heartbeat of the employee base. Maybe talk about what regular communication looks like, and then how do you really keep your pulse on what's happening? Because people will sometimes say one thing to your face and be doing it, completely different, something completely different. So as the new acquirers, or if you're the owner that's recapitalized and you're sticking around, how do you maintain that communication channel?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of management by walking around. That's really hard to do in the middle of COVID. But, regular check-in calls, frequent one-on-ones where possible are a really good way to do things. Where you have a larger organization and that's not possible, I'm a really big fan of frequent push communications where you're sharing integration updates, or if you're announcing, before you've closed the deal and you've got some closing conditions in place, let people know where the transaction is. One of the things that I actually do in the book, and I do when I talk with employees, is I compare the process of buying a company to the process of buying a home, just because most of us have seen House Hunters once or twice. We kind of know how buying a house works. And I find that putting it into simple language that the employees understand so they know where things are in the deal, they know what's going on, is really helpful. And then checking in. Now, on the buy side, my secret weapon is almost always the person who staffs the front desk.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually a really wonderful lady. She's usually kind of the office mom.
Yep.
And let me tell you,
Everybody
you've done
passes
it.
by her all day long, or him, right?
Yep. So, everybody passes by that person. And quite honestly, I try to form a relationship with that individual early on.
Smart. Great advice.
Yeah.
I think that is great advice. They tend to hear everything, right? Intended or unintended, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing that we have to realize is that, just as human beings, we're really designed to survive out in, jungles and deserts and not really office environments. So when we look at the threats that are around us, we're always going to assume the worst, because if we're out, hunting the lion and we hear the wind or the brush move, if it's just the wind, well, then we're a little embarrassed. But if it's that lion, we better be running.
Yeah.
And so in an acquisition where people are worried about their financial survival, they're going to react as if it's that lion coming to get them.
Yeah.
They're going to make up the worst story possible, because that's what we're wired to do as human beings to survive.
Yeah. The other thing, Klint, that I was watching a movie the other night, and I was thinking about this interview. The movie is Greater. It's a movie on Netflix. It's about this collegiate football player, Brandon Burlsworth. And it's a sad, and it was a great movie. It was very moving for me. And in his senior year, his head coach got fired, and the new head coach came in, Houston Nutt, to take over the program. And in his initial speech, he said, "We're going to rebuild." And he, as a senior, was thinking, I've dedicated 3 years of my life or 4 years, because he was redshirted, to this program. I don't want to rebuild. I want to win now. And he went to the coach and he said, "Hey, I would really appreciate if you never said rebuild, because I've put my heart and soul into this, and I want to win now, and I think we can win now." And I was thinking about this interview in the context of most buyers buy a business because they want to make it something much better, right? Yeah. And I think there's a slippery slope where you come in and say, "Hey, I've bought this business, and we're going to do these 10 things, and we're going to make it much better." But the psyche of the employees they've been working their butts off. They've put their heart and soul into this business. And now you're telling them that everything they've done is kind of crap, and you're going to remake it all. And that may not be the best message unless a company is in complete shambles, which is, sometimes the case, but not usually the case. Do you have a perspective on that, coming from an HR angle?
Yeah, absolutely. We want to build people up. And to your point, I really believe that when we're doing due diligence, and most companies do a decent diligence, I think, of the very top person, right? The founder or the CEO. And then it starts to fall apart the minute you get down an extra level. But you have to assume that CEO or that founder has done a decent job of finding the right people to build that business to the point where it was an attractive target to you, unless you're buying a distressed asset. And that's a different bit of math.
Right.
I absolutely think that you need to acknowledge that to employees, to say, "Hey, you've built this great thing. You've built this really awesome product or service, and it's something that we want to continue to move forward with." I think this really fits into that leadership risk category. There's a couple of different tools in the book on different ways to assess your leaders and your key players, and then some ways to think about retention beyond just slapping a 2-year button share retention program on them, but some other creative ways to look at retaining people, whether you need them to integrate the business or to operate the business. But it doesn't matter how much money you throw at people if you've made them feel bad about being there, if you've made them feel like you don't value them.
Right.
I wouldn't want to stick around in that environment.
Right. So I think the message to acquirers is you really have to be careful, right? Yeah. We know you want to make it much better, but don't don't just gloss over the fact that these people have put many years into building what it is, and good enough that you've bought it, you've paid something for it. So it had to be somewhat decent or you wouldn't have been buying it. Now, how do you build up the employees and take them to the next level?
Well said.
So, this all leads to you've got 70 deals and years of experience. You've written this book, and then you go off and start the HR M&A roundtable. Is that right?
Well, so the roundtables have been around for about 3 years. And I was really, really quite excited to get them going, and it took off in a way that I just didn't expect it to. You know, Dominic, if you think about being a corporate guy like I've been for my whole career, I learned how to do M&A one way, the way for the company that I started doing M&A with. But there are so many other ways to do deals and so many things that we can learn from one another. And that's why podcasts like yours are so popular. It's why I recommend people go out and listen to it, so that they can learn these other perspectives. So I look at the roundtables as really taking that to the next level where, I'm not just going to hear ideas from folks that are doing really cool things. I'm going to talk about those ideas with my peers, and we're going to try to do M&A better. And, some folks have said, well, isn't that a competitive advantage for your company? And I'm like, well, I'm actually not convinced it's a unique competitive advantage. I really think that a rising tide lifts all ships. And when we look at how M&A affects people, and it affects communities, and it affects investors, and it just affects our entire ecosystem, doing it well is something that should be of interest to all of us. Yeah. And so, we don't talk about specific deals. We don't, name targets, but we do talk about ideas. We talk about our successes, and we talk about the times that, maybe it didn't go so well. Some of my best learned lessons were the times that I just completely messed something up. But you know what? I don't make that mistake again. I go on to make new and different and more interesting mistakes next time.
Well, what a great idea to do this and start these roundtables for HR executives, because like yourself, right? You were in HR, you were asked to be part of a deal team, but you had no M&A background, right? And I contend that I don't care what you're acquiring, the people in the business are the most important asset. And they make the engine run. They deal with your clients. They develop the products. They make them better. And HR is one of those things that, doesn't get enough attention in M&A deals. And I'm so happy that there are people like yourself out there that have brought it to the forefront. And I think the roundtables are tremendous.
Well, thanks so much. And thank you for being a guy that signal boosts that. I think inherently, we all know that. We all know that the people are important, but I think it's really hard. My undergraduate degree's in accounting, right? Mm-hmm. So I didn't start off really thinking I was going to stay in the world of HR. It's not something that we discussed in my accounting classes was how to really look at people. And so I hope that taking my deal experience and putting it into written form is something that will help people to think a little bit differently about the people, leadership, and culture elements of a deal, and really make that difference in their transactions. And hopefully it'll improve the bottom line for them too.
Yeah, tremendous. This is awesome. Dr. Kendrick, we're going to wrap up here, but are there any parting thoughts that you'd like to share with the M&A Unplugged community?
Well, again, thank you for having me on. And I think I would simply close by saying that, if you don't feel like you're paying enough attention to the people in your deals, if you've got that suspicion that you're not, then follow that gut hunch. And just think for a few moments about what it would be like for you to be sitting in that chair at announcement day when your boss walks in and says, "We've just been purchased." And I think that's a really solid starting point for folks to just kind of put themselves in that chair, close their eyes for a few minutes and say, what would I want to know? What would I want to hear? What would I want to be able to plan for? And I think just starting from that place of empathy makes an enormous difference. And it'll shape how you do your diligence. It'll shape how you do your integration. And hopefully, again, it'll help you realize deal value a little bit faster.
Totally agree. If folks in the M&A Unplugged community wanted to get in touch with you, how could they reach you?
Great. So I'm an open networker on LinkedIn, so that's a good place. And then our website is mandaroundtable.com. We're hosting a conference later this year, and they can find some information on that, or just take a look at some of the resources that we have. It's really just a peer learning environment. This is something I do out of passion. This isn't a big consulting business that I run. This is really a passion project designed to help lift the community up, and hopefully there will be resources that folks can use there.
Awesome. Dr. Kendrick, so nice to have you here.
Great. Thanks so much, Domenic. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care. I hope you enjoyed this episode. All of today's information will be available in the show notes. If you enjoy our content, please remember to subscribe and review our podcast. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the M&A Unplugged podcast. And until then, please remember that scaling, acquiring, or selling a business takes time, preparation, and the proper knowledge.